This episode, I'm joined by John Zerzan, who is an anarchist, a primitivist, and the author of multiple books. Most recently, he has published Time and Time Again and A People's History of Civilization. Enjoy. Okay, so the first question is the Hermitix question. If you can place three thinkers into a room, living or dead, and listen in on the conversation, which three do you pick?
Thinking this over, maybe we should skip that because I think the three people I would most enjoy interacting with are not super well known.
Oh, okay. So, like, close friends?
Well, Freddie Perlman, for one, who's a theorist of civilization critique. Unfortunately, he's not really widely known.
He wrote Against Leviathan.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. We can veto this and get straight into
okay.
The thing, the kind of direction I wanted to take this in, because you're an anarcho-primitivist and you often talk about the political side of things a lot, but your two latest books, A People's History of Civilization and Time Again, I found them to be more so philosophy. There's elements of political philosophy, but they were more directed towards philosophy. So I think perhaps an extremely quick explanation of anarcho-primitivism, just so we can utilize it later and listeners will know what it means, if you could possibly succinctly describe it.
Well, I think it's understanding that every civilization has failed. This one is failing. There's only one left, in my view, and why is that? What is the driving aspect of civilization? I think it's domestication, domination of animals and plants, domination of nature. It leads to ruin. So a radical critique, I think, has to be situated at that level. Otherwise, it doesn't really come to grips with the fundamental stuff.
Great. Okay, we can definitely use that. So, I mean, I'm already kind of using problematic language of domestication there. Using everything and utilizing everything. So one of the things that's brought up kind of constantly in your book, People's History of Civilization, is this idea of return, of linearity, and you quote John Vorst, and he mentions that the possibility of returning to a hunter-gatherer society is impossible because we've made this intellectual leap. We've made certain intellectual leaps, like huge ones, which you say symbols, number, things that have assimilated into the human mind. We've made these leaps, and due to this intellect, a reversion to a hunter-gatherer society now would be, it's problematic. It's almost impossible. Do you think that his criticism of a reversion, do you think that's already just too reliant on a linearity of time and a presupposition of time? Do you think that reversion is possible at all?
Well, it's possible. It's at least conceivable. He might be right. It may not be in the cards. But if we're speaking of intellect, it seems to me, if we don't want to keep going down this suicidal path, intellect tells us to not go in that direction. And whether or not we were to arrive at a direct, non-symbolic interaction, that's very impossible to find out whether that will actually happen. But I don't think we're destined. We have no choice in the matter. There's so much we can undo. The direction, in my view, toward health and freedom and a world that doesn't come out in the way this one is coming out. I mean, it's a disaster. It's not only the environmental catastrophe that's already arriving, it's everything else in society. I write about quite a lot about, and this is more specific to the U.S., I realize, but the mass shootings, the rising suicide rate, even longevity is going back, is slipping the other way. It's not working out well. So I don't subscribe to those who say, well, it's just too late, can't do anything. We don't know if we can't do anything unless you try it. And I think it's a cop out to say, well, we've come so far. That's kind of, here we are on the cliff. We've gone too far. We can't go back. And I was in Brazil once and I saw the cover of a booklet made by some anarchist kids, and it showed people jumping off the cliff, and the caption was, well, we've come this far, we can't go back now. And they're just jumping off the cliff. I thought that was just perfect.
Mm. Yeah.
As to how that would work out, how, the different levels of thinking and activity, that's, remains to be seen. But I don't want to rule it out. I don't want to close the door on a liberatory possibility.
Yeah. I mean, these possibilities are often seen as communes and smaller societies, small villages. And this, I mentioned, this is documented in a book by Richard Fairfield called The Modern Utopian. And he's pretty unbiased, but you assume by the end as the reader that the whole atmosphere and action of the 60s and 70s in terms of those alternative communes was made impossible. So these, not ruling out reversion and saying, we could go back. There's possibility. I don't want to, we don't want to just get into this. We're destined for industrialization. So you have to look for these possible exit strategies. Is there any practical form of exit that you see that can coexist or exist outside of industrialization now? Or has it just become this kind of behemoth of all-consuming thing?
Yeah, I think it's a qualitative thing. Everybody wants amelioration. We look for different reforms and whatnot, but that really misses the point. If the whole enterprise is toxic and disastrous and means this civilization too will collapse, will fail, well, you've got to look at it in those terms, And it's not. I don't see it that it's all that incredibly utopian. If we're talking about reversion in your term, there, we lived that way for almost 2 million years. The oddity, the aberration, is what has happened in the last 9,000 years. That's the blink of an eye. So things were very stable for the longest time. There wasn't war, there wasn't overpopulation. There wasn't work, or just it does sound utopian in itself, but banned society was essentially egalitarian, right? That's just anthropological orthodoxy. Any basic course in anthropology tells you that. So the dystopian thing, the odd thing in the picture is civilizational. That's the crazy part, and it's very, very recent, and we got to get rid of it.
So what do you consider some of the driving forces, the key driving forces that led to this anomaly? 9,000 years is an anomaly within against 2 million. So what were the key things that kind of changed?
The turning point is domestication, is the reversion from hunter-gatherer life to farming life, to the idea that we can control everything, we should control everything, we should control more and more of everything at a deeper and deeper level. That was the wrong turn. Stanley Diamond said that was the worst mistake in history, worst mistake in human existence. That was the wrong turn. So it's a matter of undoing that wrong turn. If it had turned out well, well, that's another matter. But it hasn't turned out well, to say the least, right? So,
what would you say to those who say that it has, though? That they might show you a car or the moon landing or things along those lines that are the stereotypical visions of the innovative atmosphere of civilization. What would you say to those who say, well, look at what we've done?
Yes, look at what we've done, exactly. And speaking of the moon landing, something I think of now and then is that fabulous picture taken from the moon, from Earth to, it shows the blue planet, and it's the iconic image of all kinds of environmental posters and so on, right? Fabulous. Mm-hmm. Okay, what does it take to get that picture? It takes massive industrialization of the planet. So yeah, it's a lovely it's an inspiring picture to look at it that way. But if you look at it a little bit more deeply, wow, what does it cost to get that picture? The answer is having that picture in the first place. It doesn't waft down from heaven having this lovely photo. I mean, just think of what's involved. I mean, there it is. It's innovative, yeah, in a disastrous sense.
Okay, yeah, that's an extremely prevalent point. That's actually well spotted. That's yeah, there's a difficulty here because you're dealing with people who are so steeped and assimilated into locked in systems. And you mentioned Michel Serres in your a couple of times in people's history, and he's not mentioned very often. I was very happy about that. And he has this brilliant quote where, just to paraphrase, it says, man carries the assimilation. You mentioned time, symbols, ritual. He carries all these things. Serre puts this mainly towards economizing and an economy. So everywhere man steps is the possibility of economy within civilization. So a man from civilization, Western man now steps into the rainforest, and even without any civilization there, it's an economical. It's an economic place already because his mind is there. How does one in the primitivist mode of thinking kind of detach and stop that all these forms just coming into your mind?
Well, it's just a different mindset, isn't it? It's a different paradigm. I mean, Heidegger made a similar point. Everything is just sacrificed to technology. Everything is devoured by it. It doesn't even have any meaning unless it can be offered up to technology, the maw of technology, and that's utterly wrong. It changes everything. It changes thinking. It even destroys thinking, as he put it somewhere, and then he kind of backed off a bit from that, I guess. But there it is, that's the wrong way to look at it. It's just utterly wrong. And look what it brings. Look what it brings. If it's a happy picture, then, why grouse about it? But it's anything but a happy picture. People are not happy. They don't believe in this stuff anymore, but they don't know where to go. I mean, it's a tough question. It's a mammoth challenge. Yeah, okay, everything you say is right. Let's just assume that. Now what? Okay, it strikes people as such an inevitability, such a quote natural development, that it's very, very hard to think against it, and more importantly, to act against it. But that's what has to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of inevitability, your short book, Time and Time Again, is fantastic on this on sort of an a priori assumptions of time. I wondered if perhaps you could just. It's quite a new book, and I wondered if you could expand on the form of control of it within time that's come about because of industrialization.
Well, and even deeper than that, I mean, I think that's the first symbolic dimension, time. That is time consciousness when we become colonized by it, and it's a very gradual thing, and it greatly speeded up by industrialization, as your William Morris outlined very brilliantly in his work. It's just time. Just everything is divided up into time. We are slaves to the clock because we're slaves to industry. You have to have everything timed, because the industrial enterprise is a coordinated thing that involves everything. You just have to have it in that way. So it gradually enters the picture, time, and then it gallops into the picture. And now we're utterly tyrannized by it. It becomes more and more an objective thing. It's always very mysterious. Augustine in the 4th century or so said, I know perfectly well what time is until somebody asks me to define it. It's elusive, but it becomes more and more reified. It becomes more and more that which stands over us. And it's just another way to understand industrial life, civilization at its more apparent last stages, I would say.
Is there much anthropological research on primitivist notions of time, or how they viewed it, or if they viewed it?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of it. I mean, that's been noted by different ethnologists and anthropologists, how various people don't even have a sense of time. They don't know what that means because they don't. It really hasn't become internalized. Their life doesn't need to be coordinated by the clock. I mean, it just doesn't. And then when you get more and more complex society, more coordination and hierarchy, then it does start to enter the picture. It intrudes, and slowly, very slowly, it becomes this objective reality. It's still hard to define. It's kind of a lovely mystery in a way, a horrible mystery perhaps. When Einstein was asked, "What is it?" he said, "It's what a clock measures." But that's kind of cute because it still doesn't tell you anything, except it does when you think about it. Why is that? Why do you want a machine to measure whatever that is? It's kind of illuminating in a way, but it's also sort of cool the way he sort of plays with it, I would say.
Mm. Speaking, this is the times of almost the ultimate control device. Then, in that sense, and you bring to the fore in people's history that ritual was one of the big, the first, some of the what we'd call outlined, structured methods of control within contemporary societal activity. Do you see that? Do you see consumerist purchase, Black Friday? Think horrible things along these lines. Is this another form of ritual? Is this just another kind of a Nietzschean return of ritual?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure about that. I don't know. I tend to think of it more as when you don't have much freedom, you do have the freedom within consumption. You can, choose brand A or brand B or something, and so that's about all that's left in terms of freedom. And so it isn't too surprising that people consume. That's a sphere of freedom in a sense. I mean, in a very limited sense, but within that sphere, you can you have some choices. I'm not sure whether it constitutes ritual or not. It's maybe it is. I don't know.
Okay. So there was an essay by John Michael Greer. I'm sure you're aware of his work. The Twilight of the Empires, it's called, and you mentioned the fall and the Christian notion of the fall, and then Armageddon and Eden, that kind of structure, that mythical structure. That's kind of a constant thing throughout history, which can be kind of assimilated onto different movements, and yet within your work, it seems that you leave primitivism aside from that. And Greer actually mentions that the return to hunter-gatherer lifestyle can be applied to sort of a utopian dream of a return to Eden. Would you simply say that, well, once again, the 9,000 years, this is just a blip and we'll go back to that? Or do you think there's something in that I'm just simply playing devil's advocate here, but, to say that, that time is gone, that's just a kind of a dream for Eden there.
Well, yeah, it is gone, and in one sense, of course, it is. You can't reverse. So the return is, these terms are a little tricky, but I don't think that is a myth, and it's interesting as you imply there. It's always popping up. The fall. I think it's not a myth. There was a fall. For example, there was an original sin, you could say, and that's domestication. That is eating of the forbidden fruit, and it sets everything off on the wrong way. And it's kind of a constant. The idea of a golden age. Every single culture seems to have one, whether it's across the board. I mean, I don't know where you don't find it. That things were, as Rousseau points out, there was this time of harmony and so forth, and then you get to domestication, and it's all gone, and there it is. I mean, it's not just it isn't just something that's cooked up. It corresponds to a reality in what actually happened.
Hmm. You mentioned Rousseau there. You're extremely sympathetic to his work in people's history, and do you simply see his sort of opposite, Thomas Hobbes, as his work as kind of simply a product of civilization then?
Well, yeah, and maybe one thing about Rousseau, maybe it's one reason I bring it up. I'm sick and tired of this noble savage thing, which is now just a knee jerk, current sort of postmodern slur. Uh, that always annoys me a lot. Like when we talk about the actuality of hunter gatherer life, oh, that's nothing but that noble savage myth of Rousseau. That's a lot of crap. Well, it's not a lot of crap. It's just, and the way I look at it is, I'm not so utterly clear as to what noble means, but I think I do know what ignoble means. Okay, and we've seen the ignoble, and you want to trash these people or our respect for that dimension, that hunter gatherer, that indigenous dimension, but I don't, and I find it very cynical and repulsive. Those people are always just trashing it uh, with their sort of postmodern usage.
Huh. Yeah, that almost seems like I'm not intentionally bringing him up here, but Kaczynski's point about Western society merely wanting to assimilate other cultures into its own industrialization, whereas they kind of front this lie about wanting to have multiculturalism, but the reality is actually they're bringing them in, and then once they're in, they kind of assimilate them into middle class life. Perhaps the noble part of the savage is a very long term plan as a means to kind of go, how can we commodify the uncommodifiable? How can we commodify hunter gatherer life?
Well put. Yeah, exactly. And of course, there's been a lot of resistance to it as well. I think of James C. Scott's work, thinking like a state and so forth. He's talking about upland Southeast Asia and how people have held out against the state and against being assimilated. They for centuries even now are somewhat successful in that. It's not they haven't totally succeeded even now in assimilating people. I think of the whole thing about technology, the question of access. Everybody should have the right of access. Well, as you say, I think or imply, it's more the other way around. None shall escape. You don't have to worry about access. They want to strap you into it as fast as they can. No doubt about it. I mean, you don't have to help them do it. I mean, of course, I'm speaking as a Luddite. I don't want them to succeed, and I hope there's more and more resistance against that very process.
Well, yeah, that's ultimately the problem that kind of I think capital cannot stand stagnation. It can't deal with it. It doesn't do anything for profit mechanisms. So
Right.
something that's been around for 2 million years in the same state, I mean, that's abhorrent to capitalism.
Right. Yeah,
Um,
it's such a mystery to anthropology and archaeology how things didn't change in terms of stone tools, for example. The realization is they had an intelligence pretty much equal to ours, but they didn't change anything, and it's very frustrated because we're all conditioned to, as you say, always change everything, always improve, quote, improve everything. Well, really, that's a false picture. I mean, or a false value.
yeah, you mentioned in your email that you wish to kind of discuss postmodernism, and one of the things I think the postmodern culture's done with even the word technology, and you say that improvement, the innovation, progression, these things. When people think of technology, most people now think of the latest iPhone or they think of gadgetry. And Greer makes this great point about, well, you can think of technology and it could be a stone axe, it could be a slide rule. These are all still forms of technology, and the postmodern culture just kind of clicks into an accelerative force of just constant progression.
Right. Well, by the way, I think it's useful. I make the distinction between tools and technology, whereas the one doesn't necessarily have much of any division of labor. But when you start getting into more division of labor, then you have systems. Necessarily, you have systems, and that's the technology part. I'm all for tools, but
Okay.
it kind of muddies the water to say, well, everything is a technology, and that's true in a way. But I think it's more helpful to make that distinction personally.
That's certainly a Heideggerian point of view as well.
I guess.
Actually, that. So, what's your kind of take on postmodernism? How do you read it as a primitivist?
Well, I'm not saying there was nothing of value in that turn, post-structuralism to postmodernism, but overall, frankly, I think it's been very, very debilitating. I think a lot of it originally was against the totalizing aspects of Marxism. Lyotard and so forth. They bring up the point that, and this is where it becomes, I think, something that is disabling. In other words, the fundamental point that the rejection of meta-narrative, right? The rejection of overview, the idea that any take on the totality is necessarily totalitarian. Well, to me, that's kind of crazy. If you don't want to grasp the whole, then you're just a slave to it. You don't even know what's going on. So I'm very much opposed to that. When one doesn't have to be a Marxist to want to have some grasp of the whole. What the hell is this all about? What's going on and why? That's what I hate about it. And I've tried to get into fights in talks in lots of countries. When I know there's a bunch of postmodernists in the audience, I'm always baiting them. I'm just trashing that idea and some of the rest of it as well. And they just chuckle. They just find it very amusing because it's so cynical. It's just, and I think, it's not too far-fetched, by the way, to say the post-truth era here in America with Trump and all that, it's where postmodernism comes to infect the whole culture. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that. Nothing means anything. It's all equal and all that garbage. It's just, then you're just left with nothing. You have no guidelines. You have nowhere to go with thinking because you rule out the most fundamental thing. What is it all about? What are we talking about here? What is the nature of society, the nature of technology, the nature of, 50 other things? You've just decided that that's a bad thing. You're virtually a fascist, according to some, at least an authoritarian, to want to figure things out. I mean, that's poison. That's why we're in such a fucked up place. That's part of it. And it stems from a period of defeat and reaction. It burst forth in the 70s and 80s. Well, we haven't really come out of that. Where are the social movements? So this is just part and parcel of an era in which we're stymied. There's not a hell of a lot going on. There was the anti-globalization movement in the late 90s. That was pretty hot for a couple of years, but it didn't last. And now we're back in the doldrums. So it's pretty much a function of a very backward period, in my view. I'm not saying that's all there is to postmodernism, but to me, that's a pretty key aspect.
Yeah, it reminds me there what you just said of an interview with David Foster Wallace, where someone asks him, what is postmodernism, and he quickly goes, "You mean after modernism?" Because postmodernism makes it seem like a movement, a coherence. No, it's simply this kind of a free-floating signifier after modernism.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Which,
well, it's such a dumb, slippery term. Post this, post that, post everything, right? But what does it really tell you? It's just, you don't get anywhere with that. It's another a way of avoiding things, in my opinion. And I'll give you one example. Post-left, very, very current among anarchists. I'm an anarchist, right? So it's everybody's post-left now. It has almost no meaning. It's very weak and slippery and vague. I am anti-left, okay? We got to get rid of that crap or we're not getting anywhere. Post-left, what the hell does that mean? It really doesn't mean much of anything. Figure out where you're at and spit it out. Let's have it. Let's put it on the table and argue about it. But this post everything is just is weak.
Yeah. And yeah, and also you speak of left and right. The problem with them is that people forget that they themselves aren't stagnant points. They're created in time and they're in time themselves, and so they move. And I think Robert Anton Wilson said a conservative who stands still for 20 years becomes left wing. It's
Yep. Well, we just
um,
changed the name of our journal, Black and Green Review. The brand new issue, number 6, which is at the printer right now, we changed the name to Wild Resistance because black and green is a reference to again the political configuration, the how you define yourself in terms of anarchism, and we really want to get past that. We want to get to a deeper place where we're not really defined by this or that flavor of anarchism. I mean, I think all of us consider ourselves anarchists, but we're not enthralled to that. We're trying to maybe go deeper and not be locked into anything.
mhm. Okay. I mean, you've mentioned you've now mentioned Heidegger, Lyotard, and in people's history you mentioned Sayre, Derrida, Foucault, Adorno, Habermas, Gadamer, and Marx, and I was taken aback because I thought this is a serious repertoire of continental philosophers. Is there and that's my personal route of study as well. Is there a reason you I don't want to say used, but I guess came to these philosophers as helpful in your writing?
Well, exactly, helpful. That's the point. I mean, I pick and choose, and if I cite somebody, it certainly doesn't mean I necessarily agree with their whole line of thought. Whatever it is, hermeneutics or you name it. I mean, and I'm afraid that can be confusing to people. You can quote the Bible. It's such a common literary fund, among other things. But if I do, that doesn't mean I'm a Christian or a Jew. I quote something to make a point, to underline a point, and that's all. That's it. It's the rest of it is more of interest to me or not. It's that's the way I go about things. Is it useful to try to flesh out a line of thinking or not? And I think it can be helpful if people are, and even if people are not familiar with these different people, sometimes there are very helpful lines or quotes. It's just as simple as that, I think.
Okay. So in relation to this, and this is the final question, roughly. These thinkers, and this relates back to postmodernism. The general direction is fragmentation, atomization, and disintegration of man into kind of smaller and smaller identities. This continual just deconstruction of kind of everything almost. This ties in with irony, postmodernism, continental thought, and what's come about from this in relation to capitalism is the accelerationist viewpoint. The finally kind of, for a lot of philosophers, it was a breath of fresh air because, like you said, people are still dealing with what Sayre called the Marx-Freud superhighway. Still, there's so many people in the academies that are still Marxists. So this idea came about, the accelerationist idea, that perhaps the only, capital, in the words of Nick Land, capitalism is strange because it's the thing that nobody really wanted, and yet we have it. And so accelerationism is the idea that the only way out of capitalism is through, is to accelerate this process. I'm wondering what you would make of that.
Well, to me, that's kind of a sorry excuse. I mean, I just don't have any feeling for that at all. I mean, that's just another way of throwing in the towel, frankly, to me. I mean, let's say it's the 30s. Yeah, let's all join the Nazi Party because then it'll get so crazy and destructive. Then somehow we'll come out fine at the other end. That doesn't make sense to me. It's only if you want to make matters worse, if you don't want any kind of resistance or coherence or anything like that, then how do you imagine things will be better later on? You're helping make the problem worse, more embedded, more invasive, and I mean, I just don't get that. I just feel like that's kind of crazy.
Well, I think the thing with it is I don't know if it's necessarily a futility, but I think even from both sides of perhaps not sides, from all political camps, it's not so much futility, but it's more an acceptance of the irreversibility of capitalism. I mean, I know you disagree with that, and the unstoppable nature of capitalism. So it's saying, well, okay, perhaps we accept that it's not going anywhere, but then how can we react to that as a means forward?
Well, I totally, maybe I'm not understanding it all that well. I'm not super conversant with that whole line of thought, I confess, but I certainly believe in exposing all of the outcomes. The way that the whole dominant culture is on display, and in my weekly radio show, that's really probably the number one thrust of the whole thing. The craziness of the past week in terms of the latest technological craziness, the latest eco disaster, and so forth. And some people think you're just smashing people over the head with how awful it is. And, that's possible to come out as real pessimistic. But what I'm saying, really, I'm trying to say is it's not only a disaster, but the system has no answers at all. And it's easily exposed. It's just, they don't even try anymore to make these claims or promises. Politically now, in fact, I believe that now it's all up to technology. That's where the claims and promises come from. The more political stuff is, by the way, it's just left behind. For example, the American dream, you just have people laugh in your face if anybody tried that here, that kind of thing. Oh, it's getting better and better, progress. Your kids will have it better. Nobody believes that. Nobody believes that. So where is it? And, I think of Ulebek's novels. He's sort of looking for the glue in some ways that holds a dead zone together. I mean, that's one theme, especially in the book Submission, as you probably know. That's a very radical question. And I guess he's quite a jerk in person or whatever. But I mean, how you've got to face up to that thing and look how bad it is. And I do battle with any of, like Steven Pinker or whoever. That's ridiculous. They have nothing to stand on. There's no case. They just don't. They have nothing left. And to point that out is somewhat liberating, I think. Sure, it looks bad. We're not winning. It's getting worse and worse. But at the same time, it's so exposed. Man, it's a disaster, and everybody knows.
So then, isn't that a good thing? Because the worse and worse it gets, the more exposed it becomes, and there's a potential there for perhaps a wound to form, if you're on that side of things, form a revolution in, or if you're on the side of a collapse and a restart. If it just continued lovely, that would be really worrying. But perhaps it's somewhat optimistic for those who don't like it that it's openly getting worse.
Well, and that maybe that does connect somewhat with the accelerationist point of view. I mean, I'm not exulting in the fact that it's getting worse. I'm more finding some hope in the fact that it's just it's just failing so vividly, so grandly. It's really destroying itself. It's imploding like every civilization has done so far, and that's some reason to take hope. And of course, I always look for the signs of resistance, and there are always some. How fed up kids are getting with social media, and how they're really bored to death with the iPhones or whatever. Different things that you see, and certainly the more vivid examples of torching the cell phone towers or burning down the McDonald's or whatever. I love to retail that every week. Stuff like that.
Okay. And unless you have some more that you'd like to add or something you'd like to promote.
I guess not. I really appreciate the things you brought up. It's very stimulating. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you.